I'm here to introduce Richard Underwood. Richard Underwood is the W.L. Matthews Professor of Law at the UK College of Law. He is the co-author of several books and numerous articles on law, legal history, perjury, famous trials, and true crime. His crime song, True Crime Stories from Southern Murder Ballads, recounts the stories and examines the trials behind songs such as Frankie and Johnny and Tom Dooley. So please welcome him and enjoy.
This is the cover of the book, which was a book designer and my publisher wife that they came up with that, and I think it's pretty cool. It's got the bloody swatch on the music. Anyway, what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the book and read a little bit and leave some time for questions. This book originated as an article I wrote. Those of you who have been in academia know that everybody is, strangely enough, kind of lockstep, and I'm at the age where I'm not lockstep anymore. And I have stacks that I build up all dealing with potential books, and so I've decided to write the books now. The hardest thing is deciding you're going to do it. So this is one of a number of books. They're all different. The article was about murder ballads and, strangely enough, poetry about murders. And back in high school and college, of course, the 50s and 60s, folk music kind of had a bit of a revival. And so I was involved in that, played different instruments and whatnot. So I always had that interest, and so I had the article, and I thought, well, I'll just keep collecting and building up the stack, and then maybe write a book. So that's where this came from. It's a little bit eccentric, I suppose, because it's I've taught for 37 years at the law school, and before that was a lawyer. So I'm looking out, as I say, I'm looking at these ballads through my old lawyer trifocals, so that it is kind of a lawyer's angle. I talk about the investigation of these things and trials, if there were. Frequently there weren't. When people buy the book, I always ask them if they can, if they're female, ask them if they can swim, because one of the students at Berea years ago was interested in this area, and she said if Appalachian women had learned to swim, we wouldn't have so many murder ballads. But what was interesting as I got into this is researching old newspapers, and I thought you would think that people were just slaughtering each other right and left in the 19th century, and actually no more than now, and a lot less actually. But I ran into some of these stories in newspapers that didn't even lead to ballads. And it was really interesting. At the beginning of the book, I'm talking about what the folk music people call old weird America. How weird was it? And it's basically as weird as things are now. All of these newspaper stories end with something like, after the slaughter, they say, we learned that this is one from North Carolina, we learned that the family are fanatical on the subject of religion and are thought to be insane, which, for the credit of humanity, we hope may be established. I thought that was a nice catchy ending. And then there's one from Lexington in 1869, where a fellow who had a farm out near Lexington Cemetery decided he was going to cut his wife's throat and then cut his child's throat. The child escaped major harm, and then he cut his own throat. And so it ends, said, it has transpired that Lee also intended to consign his little boy to the same fate of his murdered mother. He did succeed in slightly wounding him, but the little fellow got away from him and ran under the bed. Members of his family state that Mr. Lee had of late been greatly troubled about his pecuniary affairs. He was known as an extremist in politics. So it's hard to imagine in these days that people are extremists in religion and politics. But there you have it. So old weird America wasn't much different. What I have are 24 stories, about 24 murder ballads, and they're of varying length because I got particularly interested in the Kentucky ballads, particularly the obscure ballads. And in fact, one of the ballads, which I won't discuss, comes from a story that Anne D'Angelo is going to be speaking about next in her big thick book about the crime. So it's kind of interesting that we would both be talking about these things in our books. She's a lawyer too, though, so maybe it makes sense. But I begin the book with the story of Omi Wise, which was a famous North Carolina ballad. Many of you may have heard that ballad before. It was, in a way, popularized by a music anthology back in the 60s of historic music. The best known version of Omi Wise was recorded by a fellow by the name of G.B. Grayson in 1927. And the singer-narrator reports that the killer of Omi Wise, Jonathan Lewis, joined the army and avoided prosecution. And actually, that isn't what happened. And I'm pretty sure that the singer had his story conflated with the ballad from Kentucky, which most people haven't heard about Lula Vyers. And I'll read this to give you an idea about what Lula Vyers dealt with. The storyline of the ballad follows the facts of the actual case. Although there are some interesting deletions, it is a topical song inspired by the newspaper accounts of the murder. So it's almost like the broadsides from England. When something bad would happen, they'd immediately write something. The balladeer calls upon the people to listen and learn from the story of yet another poor young girl. The girl from the town of Oxear, a coal camp in Floyd County, Kentucky, loved John Coyer. Coyer had, quote, ruined her reputation, unquote, and would, quote, later take her life, unquote. So you get this ballady type of language. And Coyer took her to Elkhorn City in Pike County, Kentucky, where he told her they would be married. He put her up in a hotel, but later during a stroll, he, quote, threw her in the river, unquote, which was the Big Sandy with, quote, a piece of railroad steel, unquote, tied around her. And like Omi Wise, the poor victim pleaded for her life, and indeed the lyric from Omi Wise turns up in Lula Vyers, quote, I'll go back to my mother if I cannot be your wife. And so that became a sort of a formulary thing that you hear in these ballads. But one of the things that's interesting is her mother was a Hatfield. And I forget whether she was one of the daughters or a granddaughter, probably a daughter of the Devil Anse Hatfield of the Hatfield-McCoy's thing. But anyway, a newspaper, the body washed up near Ironton, Ohio, and a reporter who's variously named, the most common name is Aerodent, but some say Airy Went. All these things, spelling and names tend to vary. But she saw the story and went to Ironton and identified the body by her daughter's clothing, and as is the case in many of these ballads, when the girls dress up, they wear a pair of, probably their only pair of fancy shoes, and in a number of these ballads, the bodies were identified by the shoes. That's how they tracked down what happened. Anyway, John Coyer was arrested but escaped justice when, quote, an army officer came and took him off to France, unquote. So you can see the conflation of the stories. They're similar. Drowning, and fairly contemporary. Well, actually, Omi Wise was the early part of the 19th century, and this was the latter part. But you can see how it made for a formulary sort of tune. John Coyer, okay, so he was arrested and taken off to France, and I wanted to find out, what happened, and ultimately we found out. And he never went to trial because the army, by the time that he would have been tried in Pike County, was in need of soldiers. So they just rounded them up and took them under the Articles of War. They could refuse to turn them over unless all of the niceties were followed. And he went off to France and has never been heard of again, as far as I can tell. But the reason I like this is the mother must have been quite an interesting character. um, About 30 days before the body was found, John Coyer left Prestonsburg for Louisville to join the Army. Hearing that he was about to leave, Lula's mother, Mrs. Hattie, ran to the train station in time to confront him. Witnesses heard Lottie exclaim, quote, "John, this is your last chance to tell where Lula is, for I intend to kill you if you don't tell me," unquote. So she was pretty tough. He'd hardly finished denying that he had any knowledge of Lula's whereabouts when Lottie pulled out a revolver from her handbag and snapped the trigger twice, 2 misfires. She was restrained, and Coyer made his way away and joined Company C of the 1st Kentucky Regiment. Quote, "God knows I tried my best to kill him," she sobbed, "but I guess it was not so ordered." I think she meant ordained, but that's the newspaper cutting. Now, later, when John Coyer is facing what would it be like a preliminary hearing, a newspaper account reported that during the hearing, the determined Lottie attacked Coyer with a club, and Coyer fled the courtroom pursued by armed officers who ran him to ground. So she was after him, and I thought she was an interesting character. But in all of these ballads, I tried to collect any court records or newspaper accounts and then made them illustrations in my text. So there are like 90 illustrations. If you like pictures, I know I do. But that was one of the obscure ballads. Another, which you might enjoy, Stella Kenny. And I start by quoting a story from Spoon River Anthology, which remind me of this case. Actually, they weren't related. I wish they were. I keep looking for connections and disappointed sometimes. But this is from Barry Holden, one of the poems in Edgar Lee Masters' epic Spoon River Anthology. It says, "It was clear that he had gotten her in a family way, and to let the child be born would not do." And then it continues, "After listening to the story of the buggy ride, there was another murder where somebody had been with a woman in a buggy, and he was trying to get rid of her for the same reasons and killed her. So this actual murder inspired the murder in Spoon River Anthology, which was also an actual murder. So after listening to the story of the buggy ride, referring to the earlier murder, and finding of Zora in the ditch, she was the woman killed in the first murder, the first thing I saw was the hatchet." Right, and it was a farmer who killed his wife with a hatchet because he thought he could get away with it because this other guy did too, right? So he was obviously nutty, but I thought that was an interesting connection. And the reason it intrigued me was that Stella Kinney was murdered by her uncle. Ooh, I better hurry up. Well, anyway, she was a teenage girl, kind of long and gangly, and supposedly had something wrong with her mouth. And her uncle, Frazier, was the fellow who first got her pregnant when the girl was visiting to take care of Frazier's ailing wife. So he impregnates her, and when it's time to go home, he's got a bit of a dilemma. So on the wagon or buggy ride back to Olive Hill, he kills her. Right? So it was interesting. And another thing interesting is about the ballad is the lyrics are ripped right out of the newspaper, which was not uncommon. These ballads usually go through a cycle. If they're old enough, then they start out as broadside facts, a topical song, and then over time the details are left out. The victim becomes all the more virtuous, and they're formulary stories that all look alike. But this is an obscure ballad right before World War I, so the newspaper story incorporated into the ballad, and it's not great lyrics and not great music either, but I did like the one thing when they found her body, she had this, well, I'll just read this. "There was her dear old father kneeling by her side, quote, with 7 gashes in her head, no wonder Stella died. I mean, that's humorous in a sick sort of way. So anyway, those are the kind of things that are in the book, and if you like music and you like murders or you like the law, it's all blended together, and so we've been pleased with the book. Any questions I can answer? Yeah.
You make me think of an old Buffy St. Marie song, Down by the Banks of the Ohio.
Oh yeah, the
Is that
Banks of
based
the
on
Ohio,
that?
sure. I talk about that in the book. Now that was not one that you can trace to an actual crime. These are all traced to real crimes, and Banks of the Ohio was kind of one of these formulary songs that we don't know who the killer was and who the victim was, but Banks of the Ohio, of course, is a classic. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to track down the ones where I had the facts and could just put these documents out and collect them. Because some of them you can actually find the details. It makes it fun.
So this isn't a murder ballad, but The Coquette, it's a late 18th century American novel based on, I mean, the main character is Eliza Horton, and it's based on the life of Elizabeth Whitman, and in the newspaper write-up is partly what sparks the novelist to write this. The newspaper write-up has a little moralizing element to it that says, had Elizabeth Whitman not been such an avid reader of romantic fiction,
Right.
then she wouldn't have slept around as much as she did.
Right.
So
You
the
find that-
newspapers, do they do this? Do they do similar kind of thing?
Yes, in
Yeah.
fact, it derives from the British broadside tradition, where there was always, whether it happened or not, there was always a moralizing note. You notice that these American ballads always begin warning the young women to take heed, right? And then over time, the young women become more virtuous because they become formulary. And in the end, they always end with a confession, even if there was no confession. So there was that moralizing element. And it would start in the papers because many times the myth about the victim was created by the newspapers. They had that moralizing element. So that's not uncommon at all.
I was going to say, do you have just a minute to talk about the Ashland tragedy? Because it's a little bit different than the ones that you...
Yeah, most of these are start out with the murdered girl theme, and then I have a section of the girls fight back, right? So there's ballads like that, and then some are just mindless mayhem, the family annihilator who kills everybody in the family and then himself. We've got those lovely tales, and then ends with things like the Ashland tragedy. This was a case in which 2 girls and a brother, the girls were raped and then they were all killed, and who did it? And of course, if you look at the evidence, one person clearly was involved and had some accomplices who worked for him, but the fellow who they went to immediately, who was actually involved, named 2 other people, and one doubts that perhaps they were actually guilty, but unfortunately the court system and the knowledge of rules of evidence didn't fit very well. But one of the interesting things in the Ashland tragedy was the 2 men were convicted, then they got their case reversed, and then the question is, what are we going to do with them? So they had a steamship called the Granite State come down and try to pick them up at Ashland. Well, by now all the people were out up on a cliff near the boat dock area, and they decided that they were going to send out some of the local armed thugs to take these people off and lynch them, right? So they're in the boat rowing out to the Granite State, and on board the Granite State are militia. And if you've ever been in the military or known people in the military, people who are trained and have experience shoot low, because if you don't shoot low, you're going to fire over their heads. Well, the militia weren't well trained, and they missed the boat. That's an interesting expression. Missed the boat, and the guys trying to get out there, and the bullets hit the audience up on the cliff, who of course were enjoying themselves up to that point, and I forget how many people were killed and wounded. So the Ashland tragedy was just a whole bunch of idiocy compounded, and it of course led to the ballot. So I'm probably out of time now, and I don't want to take somebody else's.
Thank you.
Thank you.